In a moment that no one expected to become public, David Phelps looked at Bill Gaither across a recording studio and said he couldn't do it. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The song sitting on the music stand in front of him was one of the most beloved hymns in all of gospel music, a song that had comforted millions of believers, a song that had defined an entire generation of Christian worship. And David Phelps, a man whose voice had moved audiences to tears on stages across America, told the man who had written it that he was not the right person to sing it that day. Bill Gaither had heard a lot of things in 4 decades of gospel ministry, but he had never heard that. What David said next, and what eventually came out years later about why he made that choice, is something most of the gospel community has never fully heard, because David didn't tell the story publicly for a long time. And when he finally did, the people who heard it understood something about this man that 4 decades of concerts and recordings had never quite revealed. By the time we reach the 10-minute mark, you'll understand why this moment, this quiet refusal in a recording studio, may be the most honest and most human thing David Phelps has ever done. If you've spent any time watching the Gaither homecoming videos, those remarkable gatherings of gospel artists that Bill Gaither began recording in 1991, then you know exactly who David Phelps is. You may have been watching one of those videos the first time you heard his voice and wondered if what you were hearing was real. David Phelps joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997, at a point when the group was already well established and the homecoming series had become a staple in millions of Christian homes. He came in as the tenor, a role that demands not just range but presence, the ability to take the high notes and make them feel like prayer rather than performance. And David had that ability in a way that very few singers in any genre have ever possessed. His performance of End of the Beginning became one of the most talked about moments in homecoming history. The way he moved through that song, from the quiet opening to the final, breathtaking high notes, was the kind of moment that stays with you. Fans who saw it live described it in terms that went beyond appreciation for a skilled singer. They said it felt like something spiritual was happening in the room. For millions of people who grew up watching those homecoming tapes on VHS, or who discovered them through DVD collections passed from parent to child, David wasn't simply a member of the Gaither Vocal Band. He was the voice that found them when they needed finding. He was the tenor who sang at the graveside of their grief without knowing their name. By the early 2000s, David Phelps had become one of the most recognizable voices in Christian music. He and Bill Gaither had developed the kind of professional bond that only comes from years of ministry side by side, standing together on stages, recording together through the night, traveling across a country that had come to love them both. Which is why what happened in that studio was so unexpected, and why it took years for the full story to surface. To understand what David Phelps refused to do, and why, you have to understand where he was in his life when it happened. The early 2000s looked, from the outside, like the peak of everything. David was performing to packed houses. The Gaither recordings were reaching audiences all over the world. His voice was in the kind of form that most singers only dream about. If you had asked any observer of the gospel music world to describe David Phelps in 2002 or 2003, they would have pointed to the recordings, the standing ovations, the voice that didn't seem to belong to one human being. But that's what the world saw. What was happening inside David's life during that period was something different. His daughter Maggie had been facing serious health challenges. David has spoken in public over the years about the weight that places on a father, not just the practical demands of caring for a child with significant needs, but what it does to your faith. The questions it raises that don't have easy answers. The nights when you're a man who has stood on a stage and sung about the faithfulness of God, and then you come home and you're not sure you can hold on to that faith with both hands the way the songs say you should. David Phelps had spent years singing about hope, about healing, about the certainty that God's plan was good even when life made that plan hard to see. And somewhere in those early years of the new millennium, the distance between what he was singing and what he was feeling on the inside started to close in on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He didn't talk about it publicly at the time. This is not a story about a man who made his doubts into a press release. David kept moving. He kept singing. He kept showing up. But something was building. Here is where the story of the song begins, because the song he eventually refused to sing wasn't chosen at random. It was the song that, in his honest estimation, He had no right to sing at that particular moment, not because the song wasn't true, but because he wasn't sure he believed it the way the song required him to believe it. Stay with us. Because what David said when he finally explained this, and what Bill Gaither's response was, is the part of this story that most people, even longtime fans, have never fully heard. The song was, "Because He Lives." If you've been part of the gospel world for any length of time, you know what that song is. Bill Gaither wrote it in 1971, at a moment in his own life when he and Gloria were facing deep uncertainty about bringing a child into a troubled world. The song was their answer to fear. "Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow." It became one of the most performed hymns in the history of Christian music. It became in many ways the very center of everything the Gaither name means. And in a studio session around 2003, David Phelps sat down with the music in front of him and told Bill Gaither he could not be the one to sing it that day. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected. David didn't say he didn't want to sing the song. He didn't say he had a scheduling conflict, or a vocal issue, or a preference for a different arrangement. What David said, and the people who were in that studio have confirmed this over the years in various ways, was that he could not sing "Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow" in good conscience. Because that morning, facing tomorrow was not something that came easily to him. His daughter was going through something difficult. His family was under enormous pressure, and David Phelps, who had built a career on singing gospel truths with absolute conviction, told Bill Gaither that he could not stand in front of a microphone and sing words he wasn't sure he could claim as his own in that moment. Think about what that took. This was Bill Gaither's own song, the song that defines the Gaither legacy more than almost any other. Refusing to sing it wasn't a small thing. It wasn't a casual creative disagreement. In any other context, with any other artist, turning down that request in that room could have ended a professional relationship. David did it anyway, because for him, singing those words when he wasn't sure he believed them felt like a kind of dishonesty he couldn't live with. Not in a recording studio, not on a stage, not anywhere. And Bill Gaither, to his enormous credit, heard what David was really saying. What Bill said in response has been described by people close to both men as one of the most gracious moments in the Gaither Vocal Band's long history. Bill didn't push back. He didn't point to contracts or deadlines or the expectations that come with being part of a ministry that size. What Bill said, in essence, was this: "Then don't sing it. Not today." Because Bill Gaither understood, better than almost anyone, that the song was written for exactly the kind of moment David was living in. "Because He Lives" was not written from a position of settled certainty. It was written from a position of fear, reaching toward faith. And a man who was honest enough to say he couldn't reach it that day was not a man who lacked faith. He was a man who was taking the words seriously enough to refuse to cheapen them. David has touched on this in interviews over the years, without always naming the specific incident. He has talked about the difference between performance and testimony, about how a song that doesn't cost you anything can't give the audience anything. He has spoken about seasons in his life when he had to step back from certain things, not because his faith was gone, but because he was being honest with God about where he actually stood. What happened after that studio session matters too. David Phelps did eventually sing "Because He Lives." He has sung it in the years since at homecoming events, in concerts, on recordings. And those who have heard him perform it with the knowledge of this story hear it differently now. They hear a man who waited until the song was true for him again. They hear the difference between a performance and a testimony. In 2005, David stepped away from the Gaither Vocal Band to spend more time with his family and pursue solo work. He has been open over the years about the personal and family reasons behind that decision. The season that led to that studio moment was part of a larger reckoning, a period in which David Phelps looked honestly at his life, his faith, his family, and his calling, and made choices that put integrity ahead of comfort. He came back. He always comes back. But the David Phelps who returned to homecoming stages in later years carried something with him that the earlier David had been still working toward: the authority that comes from having been honest about your own limits. For those of us who have followed David's journey through the years, this story isn't surprising in the way the headline might suggest. It doesn't change what we know about David Phelps. It deepens it. We've watched this man stand on a stage and close his eyes and find something in a song that the rest of the room didn't know they needed until he gave it to them. We've watched him hit notes that shouldn't be possible, and then look up like he wasn't entirely sure where they came from. And we've watched him, over the years, show a kind of transparency about his own humanity that is rare in any public ministry. What this story tells us, and this is what the gospel community should sit with, is that the most trustworthy witnesses are the ones who know when they're not ready to testify. The ones who understand that using sacred words without meaning them does a violence to those words. David understood that, and he made a choice that most people, under that kind of professional pressure, would not have made. There is something here about what it means to be a person of faith in the real world, as opposed to faith as a performance. David Phelps has always lived in that real world, and the moments when he has been most honest about that, the moments when he has said, "I'm not there yet," rather than pretending otherwise, are the moments when his testimony has carried the most weight. If you've been a fan of David since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what we mean when we say there is a version of David Phelps that the camera catches, and a version that exists in the quiet moments between the songs. This story is about the quiet version, and it turns out that's the version worth knowing. We'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Whether this story connected to something in your own life, a season when the familiar words didn't come easily, when the faith felt just out of reach. This community is full of people who understand exactly what that feels like. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet. David Phelps is not the only artist in the Gaither family who has had to navigate the space between what you sing on a stage and what you're carrying at home. The homecoming world, for all its warmth and music, has been filled with people holding things that didn't always show up in the harmonies. Russ Taff, whose voice has been called one of the most powerful instruments in gospel history, spent years performing with a depth of emotion and raw conviction that concealed a personal battle with alcohol that had gone on far longer than most of his fans knew. When Russ finally spoke publicly about his struggle, through the documentary that bore his name, the gospel community heard something that reframed decades of performances. Every song they had watched him sing with such visible anguish suddenly had new dimensions, because they were watching a man who was fighting, even as he sang. Bill Gaither has said that the homecoming gatherings were never designed to be a showcase of perfect people demonstrating perfect faith. They were meant to be, and this was intentional from the beginning, a gathering of real people who had real stories and who sang about what they knew to be true even when their lives were complicated and painful. That thread runs directly from Russ Taff's story to David Phelps's moment in that studio. The decision to be a real person inside a ministry that can sometimes, not by design but by perception, feel like it only has room for the victories. The willingness to say, in whatever way is honest, "I'm not there yet." Bill Gaither has seen both the extraordinary and the broken in the artists he has brought into the homecoming family over the decades, and the artists he has held closest, the ones with the longest and deepest relationships with the ministry, have almost uniformly been the ones who were honest with him about who they really were. David Phelps refusing to sing a song he felt he couldn't honestly claim in that moment was exactly the kind of honesty that Bill Gaither has, from the very beginning, built his ministry to hold space for. That's what's behind the warmth you feel watching those homecoming stages. That's why those rooms have always felt, to the people watching at home, like somewhere real was happening. What comes next for David Phelps is something the gospel community will be watching closely. He continues to perform. He continues to bring that voice to stages and sanctuaries across the country. And he continues to carry with him everything that shaped him, the years of extraordinary music, the years of personal difficulty, and that moment in a recording studio when he chose honesty over comfort. There's a question this story leaves open, and it's worth sitting with. David's willingness to let this piece of his story emerge, in the fragments it has surfaced over the years, suggests he believes his audience deserves that honesty, that the people who have spent decades listening to him sing about the faithfulness of God deserve to know that he has not always been certain, that faith, for him, has been a living thing rather than a fixed position. What that means for the songs you've heard him sing all these years, whether it makes them feel more true or more complicated, is something only you can answer. Whatever comes next, the people who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing: David Phelps's story isn't finished, and neither, it seems, is his willingness to be honest about it. If this story moved you, The next video is one you'll want to stay for. We've been covering a chapter in the Gaither homecoming story that most fans have never had the full picture on, and what came out of it changed things for everyone involved.